Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome PBS NewsHour co-anchor and managing editor, Judy Woodruff.
I will say, as a news person, as a journalist, I just want to point out that last week, okay, the mic's not working. Hold on. I think I forgot to turn my mic. You did. TV person should know this. Can you hear me now? Yes. Do I need this too? Yes. Okay, I do. All right, we'll hold this. You would think television person would know to hold the microphone, get the microphone on. Last week we had the Pope. This week we have 5 former and current chairs of the National Endowment of the Arts. This is a rare coming together of this group, so please give them the welcome that I know you agree with me they deserve, beginning with the actress and author Jane Alexander, appointed by President Bill Clinton in 1993. She served for 4 years till 1997. Jane Alexander. Next, the American folklorist, also by President Bill Clinton. He served from 1998 until 2001, Bill Ivey. Musician and arts administrator, appointed the current chairman by President Obama. She began her service last year in 2014. Please welcome Jane Chu. Broadway theater producer, appointed by President Obama also. He served as chairman from 2009 to 2012. Rocco Landesman. And finally, businessman and longtime arts enthusiast, appointed by President Reagan in 1981. He served until 1989, Frank Hodsell. This is a crowd that knows how to applaud. So let's dive right in, and let's start by talking about the essence of the NEA over time, and talk for just a few minutes about why is this agency necessary? Why was it a great idea when President Lyndon Johnson created it in 1965? Why does it endure as a good idea? And Frank Hodsell, you are our earliest chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. I want to start with you.
Thank you, Judy. Is this working? Yes. I think it's important, and indeed was designed that way by Roger Stevens, who was the first chairman, without whom I'm not sure Lyndon Johnson would necessarily have made this a priority. And then by Nancy Hanks, who spread the endowment out across the country. And it's important because it created a national, if you will, a point of contact and fabric for the arts, since the arts are, are everywhere in the country and they're largely locally supported. The National Endowment brought together what is at its essence, which is its peer panels, a way of recognizing some of the best and also identifying issues that need to be dealt with. as the endowment's founding legislation says that material conditions are needed as well as freedom of expression. As it progressed, particularly under the first 2 to 3 chairmen, as it progressed, it became known as a place where you could count on good decision-making, the end result of that was that it became accepted as a place to look for where investments could be made most productively, and it did.
Jane Alexander, you pick up on that. I mean, you came along 4 years after Bill Hotzel stepped down. Frank Hotzel, I'm sorry, stepped down. Why, when you came along, was the NEA the place that it was? Why did you want to be at the NEA?
After my predecessor, dear John Frohnmeyer, I'm not sure. However, the NEA was really responsible for my personal career as an actress. The Great White Hope, which began at Arena Stage, in 1965, was begun with a grant to Arena and Howard Sackler to develop the play, and it went on to run on Broadway for several years with James Earl Jones and myself and other actors after that, and then the movie, and it won the Pulitzer Prize and so on. So it was not only the first transfer from a regional theater, and Rocco may remember this, to Broadway, but it was the first Pulitzer Prize winner as well in that, and for the NEA, that was pretty significant. For me, I wanted to come into the NEA. Not only did I want to give back, but I believed so strongly, as I still do, that this is a needed part of government anywhere in the world, the arts. Without the arts, how do we know where we're going to go in the future in our imaginations? How are we going to develop this world that we're in right now?
Bill Ivey, you came along right after Jane Alexander stepped down. What did the NEA look like to you at that point? Why did you want
Jane got a big laugh, I got a little laugh, and it was because of a certain continuity around the challenges that the agency was facing. There was a lot of playing defense at the time because the agency was under attack unfairly from a number of different quarters. And that perhaps obscured its value for a time. I would build on what Frank said in talking about the importance of the agency. I think initially, Bob Lynch is here. He knows in the mid-1960s, the nonprofit arts sector was very small, and I think the NEA played a major role in growing it. Things like the Great White Hope focused public attention on the value of public investment in the arts. And the sector grew, and now it's a very big, very mature sector, and I think now the agency perhaps has, of necessity, or maybe should, through intent, convert into really being the kind of hub that Frank was mentioning, where it's really the place to have the national conversation about the value of public investment in cultural vitality. And I think that's perhaps the change that will maintain the value of the agency into the next half century.
Excuse me.
Oh, no.
Thank you. Bill Ivey, Rocco Landesman, pick up on that. I mean, how has the mission, the role that the NEA fulfills changed over time?
Well, Jane just mentioned in passing that the Great White Hope was a regional theater transfer, and Bill picked up on that. I think that's the essence of the whole subject. In our world, Jane, the whole regional theater movement was essentially created by the Ford Foundation and the NEA. It was created because there was a feeling that the marketplace should not be the only determinant of what is seen, of what art survives or what art gets presented. That this is not just a capitalist survival of the fittest, that there's art that's worth doing that has to be subsidized, that needs support. And that's the conversation that really is ongoing now in Congress, in the political arena. Are there certain things that need to be seen, that need to be done, sometimes controversial, that need subsidy, that need public support? And the NEA is a big factor in that discussion, as Bill says, in that conversation. The other thing that the NEA has always had, and I think it's invaluable because the budget is, without apology to Jamie, for 3 years or 3.5 years, I went around saying it's pathetic, and every time got a memo from OMB. I once got taken out to lunch by an OMB person who explained to me, Rocco, you know, you're not supposed to be lobbying the administration, you're in the administration. But that notwithstanding, it is a, you know, given that the budget is minimal, it's a platform. It's a great platform to lead conversations and sometimes to make provocative statements, and I think that's that's important.
So, Chairman Jane Chu, you've been here a year. How do you see this agency fitting into the art scene? I mean, you came from the middle of the country. You had a very different perspective than I think so many of us have in Washington. What role did you see this agency fulfilling, and how is it working out?
Well, it's first of all, I stand on the shoulders of those who've come before me, so I'm so appreciative of everything that you've done and gone through. But when I look at the first words that were created by President Johnson for the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, our twin siblings, the words nurture, elevate, and sustain creativity, that was from the very beginning, and I still believe that is the mission of the National Endowment for the Arts as well. It does exist for being able to make sure that all Americans have the opportunity to be engaged with the arts, and that is still what our focus is as well. So how we do that, and I also agree with Rocco in terms of echo what he's saying. The two pieces that the National Endowment for the Arts has a strong ability to do is, one, through the awards that have been given all over the years, and we've given 147,000 grants and $5 billion over the 50 years, it's stimulated and sparked more giving from others because there are matches that are required in the National Endowment for the Arts grants. We've matched, even though the requirements are something like 1-to-1, the dollars have actually been $7 to $9 the time of a single dollar of the NEA. So to spark that vitality, the NEA can start it. The theater, the Great White Hope, and many more products that and performances, productions that you all have stimulated. The other thing the NEA does seem to have is the ability not only to be that seal of approval for other dollars to come in, but the ability to convene, as Rocco has mentioned. We do have the ability to start building those national conversations, so that's where we are right now.
Well, listening to all of you, and I want to give each one of you a chance to talk about how the agency evolved during your time. But I also want to get at why, you know, everybody in this room believes that there are important functions that this agency fulfills. Why has it been as controversial as it's been? Why has there been the political debate, the political warfare at times over this agency? Frank Hutzel, how do you see that?
Well, the arts can be controversial. I would take a note from my boss, President Reagan, who in the context of what was then the Soviet Union said that artists should be free to do the outrageous, to fail, and et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, when you're dealing with taxpayers' dollars, you have to be careful that you don't cause a problem that can put the endowment into great difficulty. This also happened at the Smithsonian not so long ago, so it isn't just the endowment. The arts should be controversial, and that's part of their function. But I think that what I would sort of end up by saying is that what my colleagues here have said, which is that by creating a national conversation about all of this, while being careful to not have the endowment sort of implode in the course of all of it, you create a conversation that is broader and indeed can help produce new creativity as one goes along. So I think all of that is there.
Jean Alexander, should the arts be controversial? I mean, should there be these debates? Are they healthy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, arts have to be busting perceptions lots of the time and moving into stratospheres where we haven't even begun to be thinking about. Another phrase comes to me, Jane, from President Johnson's speech 50 years ago on this day, which is the arts so we can be masters of our technology and not its unthinking servants, which is almost prescient for what's going on today with the internet, which didn't exist then. You know, this is where a lot of the arts have migrated. There's an awful lot of controversial stuff on the internet that we don't even begin to talk about yet because we haven't even explored that. But it's going to bust open everything in the future, and I think the arts are a really vital part of that.
Bill Ivey, how do you see that question of the role of the arts
It's-
in controversy?
I think it's a very complicated question. I'll say two or three things. One is that clearly the endowment was blessed by a kind of Cold War consensus around the value of American creativity and the way accomplishment in the fine arts allowed us to stand up proudly against our Soviet adversary. And we were invested in art and culture as we were invested in human space exploration. There were things that were just enabled by that Cold War environment. But the things that were enabled could easily be demonized in a highly political environment. And when Jane was chairman, or really leading up to her chairmanship, there were individuals who learned that they could easily raise money by attacking the work of the NEA, and they didn't pay much of a penalty for it, because there really wasn't an opposition that would get them out of office if they attacked. And this became a kind of, an extra $1 or $2 on the monopoly board for anyone running who had a certain kind of ideological base. And then, of course, when those individuals, when those voices gained influence in Congress, what had been a subtext of criticism for decades, going back to Erica Young's Fear of Flying, all of a sudden could bubble to the surface and convert into real public policy. So I think those three things came together. And it remains, I think, a challenge in the background for the agency.
Do you want to comment?
Yes, come to the surface is a good way of putting it. When we were sitting among ourselves just now in the green room, I asked my fellow chairs what they liked least about their job when they had it. And Jane Alexander quickly said a lot of the homophobia that was present in her memory then. There are a lot of people who just don't like the arts, are suspicious of it. Every society in the history of the world has had arts. But there's always an undercurrent of fear, opposition to that, and the arts have become a kind of an easy target, an easy whipping post for people who are homophobic or misogynist, or the arts are always cast in the back of people's minds as something leftist, something elitist, maybe a little gay, that bubbles just below the surface of this conversation. So there's a lot of political hay to be made by attacking that, and it's almost a code for a different kind of attack.
Ray Kutzell, I want to bring you in before I ask Jane and go back to Bill and the other Jane about this. But how do you see this kind of raw, political debate, dialogue that just seems to go on and on and on?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I mean, if you look at the vast majority of what the endowment does, by that I mean 99%, it's not controversial. There are people who don't put a very high value on supporting the arts, but that's a different issue than having trouble with a specific grant or whatever it may be. I think that the endowment, because of its peer panel process and because of its reach out in a number of areas that all of us have participated in different ways, has been able to convince most people in this country that it serves the useful purposes that have already been discussed. And over 50 years, I think it's done that better than many other agencies of government. My job after leaving the Arts Endowment was if you can believe it, to be in charge of, in the George H.W. Bush administration, of the Defense Department, National Security, and International Affairs budgets, and then I became a manager at OMB. And as a manager at OMB, I was working with the inspectors general on all kinds of programs. The Arts Endowment is extraordinary. And part of it is because it's small, so it's manageable. But part of it is because it does things for 99% of the times on the merits. And as it became, particularly in the 70s and beyond, as Nancy Hanks expanded the Arts Endowment at that time, it became really valued in cities and towns and regions, small and large, with high populations and low populations, with conservative sort of proclivities versus liberal proclivities all over the country. And you can find supporters of the Arts Endowment from every conceivable part of the political spectrum. I think the arts are, as I think Bob Lynch might also say, are now recognized, so they're also economic drivers. That's part of the original sort of organizing statutes of the Arts Endowment. But the Arts Endowment is not only here to stay, in my view, it has done a heck of a lot of good, as my colleagues here have said, and done so in a way that is respected.
Jane Chu, do you have a sense that some of this controversy that you're hearing your colleagues, former chairs speak about has subsided in a way so that you don't have to worry about that as much? Or do you still feel that this is a place where you're always walking on eggshells?
It does feel like we have turned a corner thanks to the work that everyone here has done. But I'd stay at 30,000 feet to ask, what is the purpose of the National Endowment for the Arts? And just remind us that America is all about the spirit and the ideas and the creativity and the innovation. And we know that the arts bring value and meaning to America, and that has made America. So to be able to have, and because we so believe that the arts are a public good and everybody deserves to experience the arts in some way, we so believe that the National Endowment for the Arts plays that role, not only because it can spark something, and it can spark creativity and innovation, but because many, as Frank has alluded to, many agencies are created in the federal government to make sure they can regulate a specific piece. The National Endowment for the Arts is about sparking that vitality, and what a message to be able to say, we work for an agency and we stand for something that really has made America what it is. And then Frank, also, thank you for your comment about the peer review. That's what's so great, another process that is so great about the arts in America. The National Endowment for the Arts has a 3-step process in terms of reviewing its grants. So the first folks who read the proposals that come in are the citizens. Citizen panels from all over the nation come in and put their stamp on it and identify what is excellent, what is meritorious. So together with the nation, we are shaping the arts together. It's not one of those, you are artistic and you are not. It's about all the recognition, and even in the communities across the nation, that those nuances are a really big deal, because when you've seen one community, you've really only seen one community. I've noticed that after I've traveled this year. So we're shaping the arts in America together. The process is working really well, and yes, we want to be about sparking that creativity and innovation. Does that come with some of the noise? Probably, but we can't let go of that's what's the spirit of what America is all about.
I'm going to say something a little counterintuitive, and this all sounds really great. Creativity, go for it. During my tenure, I don't know if Dick Woodruff is here. Dick was our Congressional White House liaison, a terrific guy. He and I visited with 225 members of Congress, mostly opponents of the agency, because that's what was required at the time. I never went into a meeting thinking that those people were crazy because they didn't like the Arts Endowment or what we were doing. In fact, having had that experience and having looked at some controversy and seen what Jane dealt with and even what John Frohnmeyer dealt with over the years, I don't know if you can have a government agency spending taxpayer dollars on projects that push the boundaries of the First Amendment. Now, you can get out there a little, but to really be working on the edge, you're going to be constantly vulnerable because the government doesn't do that kind of thing much. It even has problems in that area in certain aspects of hard science. You don't always push the boundaries of fetal tissue research. There are things you just can't do. So I think the endowment, to an extent, has found ways to be perhaps a little more practical and constrained, and in that role has been able to maintain a good relationship with Congress.
Does everybody agree with that?
I agree that it's come to a more quiet level because there have been restraints put on the agency, and there have been some rules put on the agency about the kind of work that can be done that just began to be existent in the, when Frank was there, and then John Frohnmeyer, and then myself. What I want to say is one doesn't know actually what grants are going to spark controversy in some people. And that's the nature of art. We're never not going to be without controversy, nor should we be. And then time sometimes catches up to the most egregious or controversial kind of work. James Earl Jones and I were the first interracial couple to ever lie in a bed together on stage and have a kiss, a chaste kiss, good night kiss in the bed. However, it was a first, and it was highly controversial at the time, but it managed to move through the years, and now we would not think about this kind of thing as being controversial, nor would we think about the Mapplethorpe pieces or anything. So time catches up to the artists who are in the forefront.
I know you all, a number of you, all of you, have strong feelings, strong thoughts about where you want to see this agency go. But before we get to that, to the future, we are here to talk about the 50th anniversary. I want to give each one of you a chance to toot your own horn. I mean, go back, tell us what you did, what happened, what did you do during the time you were leading this agency, and how did you change the arts in this country as a result of that? Frank, I'm going to start with you.
Well, my introduction to the Arts Endowment was in the West Wing of the White House, where David Stockman, who was Ronald Reagan's first OMB director, thought it would be the arts, both endowments, the Arts and Humanities endowments would be good ones to simply bring to a halt because they went too far and they would be easy to defeat, which turned out, luckily, not to be true. And it was interesting because I wasn't in the arts in the White House doing arts of any kind. I was doing immigration policy, the Iran hostage return, and all sorts of things like that, budget and so on. And but it began with a roommate of Jim Baker's, for whom I worked, coming in and telling. Asking us, why are we trying to get rid of the Arts Endowment? And as I explained, that's sort of where Dave Stockman was coming from, but that's not what the president wanted to do. And so we created a task force and we overturned it. Now, to come back to sort of the main point here, when I went over to the Arts Endowment.
And just to quickly, why wasn't Ronald Reagan for doing away with the Arts Endowment?
I'm sorry?
Why wasn't President Reagan, for doing away with the Arts Endowment? He came out of that world, of course.
He came out of that world, and he had a number of good friends in California, like Chuck Heston and so on, who absolutely didn't want to get rid of the Arts Endowment. And it wasn't very difficult, to be frank with you, to make that change. I could tell an anecdote later with a Supreme Court justice about this, but I won't do that. But it's no, he was in favor of the Arts Endowment. Wasn't it the highest thing on his radar or anything like that? But there's no question that he was in favor of it. And when I was chairman, there was never a time when I couldn't get to see the President or First Lady personally on any subject that I needed to get to see them on. And he was totally supportive of the Arts Endowment throughout that period. But coming back to your question, Judy, if I understand it correctly, I think that it comes back to something Bill also said. If you keep the Arts Endowment focused on excellence, access to the arts, increased resources, and so on and so forth, there's a huge number of people out there who are for it, all over the country, conservative, liberal, who knows what their politics are. And it was never an issue. There are some people who don't care that much about the Arts Endowment, but most of those people who don't care that much about the Arts Endowment also care a great deal about the arts.
And what are you most proud of during your 8 years at the
Oh,
endowment?
my goodness.
20 words or less, and then we're going to move along.
All right. Well, I had 9 thrusts. I cut a deal before I left the White House that while there would be a 10% cut, there would be no more sort of efforts to get rid of the Arts Endowment's budget, and I didn't make a huge issue about that because I didn't want a nickel and dime. I think we created the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. We created the National Medal of Arts with the congressional assist that got the President involved on a regular basis, and members of the cabinet and so on. Secondly, we were able to I think improve the panel system, and with the help of Nancy Hanks and Hugh Southern, who she helped me get as my deputy, we were able to bring in some really reputable people to be part of that I think helped with the endowment's reputation. We then did some things that were sort of areas of opportunity, like getting Bob Redford enough money to help start Sundance, by increasing the funds for film preservation, which resulted in an Oscar for the Arts Endowment and things of that nature.
Sundance, something we've all heard of. So that was not an insignificant. Jane Alexander, your turn.
Yes. Well, I have to say that I'm, at the time, the Clinton and Gore administration was reinventing government. Do you remember that? And it really brought the budget into balance finally and very quickly, and there was rescission, and we were encouraged to make partnerships with other agencies. So luckily, there was Dick Riley at the Department of Education, and we began a number of initiatives, one that just celebrated its 20th anniversary, the Arts Education Partnership, which, yes. And Scott Shanklin Peterson, I think, who spearheaded that at the endowment, is here, and congratulations to you, Scott, for keeping after that for 20 years. And also, we made partnerships with the Department of Justice, with AmeriCorps, which started Writers Corps, which is still going in the Bronx, in Washington, D.C., and in San Francisco. An incredible program that goes into the inner city and has people writing. So those kinds of things are what I'm most proud of. The Oklahoma design concept charrette that was started after the disaster there, which ended up with the beautiful memorial of chairs, was Samina Qureshi, who was head of our design, made sure that charrette was done and the right architects got involved. Those are the things I'm most proud of.
Bill Ivey, what about during your time?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, during my tenure, we were playing defense a lot of the time. And so much of our focus was on trying to improve relations with Congress and get the agency's budget growing again. It had been cut, and after a couple of years, we were able to turn that around and get it growing. I alluded to this briefly, but I'll say a little more about it. It wasn't a conscious thought, but just rather instinctively, I kept Jane's senior staff for the most part. Some people of natural attrition turned over, but that group of people, Scott Peterson and Karen Christensen and Dick Woodruff and Sherry Simon, and my own folks, and and then career people like Larry Baden and Daniel Beatty. These were great people, and we made that turn. Scott came up with the idea for something called Challenge America, which is really a kind of empty vessel that you can put anything into it that you want to, but it's a political phrase, and it suddenly gave our friends on the Hill something to talk about that would advance the agency, that was non-threatening, and it had small grants and some ideas in it that I think were very attractive, and that's really the vehicle that moved the budget forward. I think my greatest direct contribution to the agency came years later when I came back to Washington to work in the Obama administration. It's a wonderful story that I won't tell, but right at the end of that transition, every person working in that transition was determined to get something in the stimulus bill for the agency that they were working on. And I met with John Podesta, who was heading the transition. And he's, oh, no, don't do that. You'll get $200 million later. And a few days before the end of the transition, I went directly to Peter Orszag. I said, Peter, if there's no money in this bill for the agency that I worked for, I will be humiliated. And literally 24 hours before we all packed and went home, suddenly there was $50 million for the NEA in the stimulus bill. Bob Lynch came in behind that, and AFTA, with some help, defended it. But I think that, and the agency spent it quite brilliantly. That's my understanding, although it's never really been properly reported. So that's kind of, that's my selfish, look, I don't think the administration was comfortable coming forward and saying the best thing happening in stimulus is the NEA, which is an entirely different, it's an entirely different conversation. But personally, selfishly, that was my contribution.
Now we know how things really get done in Washington. All right, Rocco Landesman, you came along 8 years later. Toot your own horn. What did you get
I
done?
remember when that stimulus bill came out, a congressman from Georgia went on television and he said, how can you spend $50 million on the NEA when that money could be spent for something useful like road building? That would give you an idea of the view of the arts, still. Well, I think Jane Chu and I are the only people on stage who haven't had to deal with really the survival of the agency. Bill talked about playing defense a lot. I remember I made my first speech in Brooklyn to funders for the arts, and I said the days of the defensive NEA are over. And I felt that what we needed to do now, building on what had gone before, that the agency had in fact survived, thanks to you guys, that to me, the part of the purpose of the NEA is to be a leveraging point for increased support for the arts all across the country in whatever way is possible. One way was, and Jane alluded to it, and it's happened, I think, with all of us, is to create partnerships throughout the government wherever we could find them. I went immediately to every cabinet secretary I could get an introduction to, and started building relationships with the other cabinet secretaries because they had the money. If you compare our budgets, HHS has $1 trillion. We have 150 million. But the arts intersect with every aspect, whether it's childhood development or geriatrics or substance abuse or anything that is dealt with over there. The Department of Defense with treatments for wounded warriors, and we can go on and on. So one way was to leverage investment in the arts through the other agencies, and the other thing for us was to create outside the agency investment. We started an organization, and the president of it is right here, Jamie Bennett, in front of me, called Art Place, that funds alongside the NEA in much greater to much greater money than is even in the Art Town program. And for that to continue, whoever's in charge at the NEA is an important add-on of resources. I think one of the things you can do once you know the agency is going to be here and survive is to leverage investment in the arts all across the board.
Chairman Chu, pick up on that. You've been here only a little more than a year, but what do you feel you've been able to accomplish? And then I want to turn to having you all speak about what you think more this agency needs to do in the future.
Well, leverage is certainly a big deal also for us, but it is also strengthening the tremendous network and it's through several things. So we're having some fun projects that we'll be starting. We're launching a high school songwriting competition. The winner's going to get to have their song sung on Broadway. We're working with Playbill and Disney Theatrical. We're adding a creativity piece to high school poetry with that wonderful program, Poetry Out Loud, that Chairman Joya started. We'll add poetry writing as well, poetry ourselves. We'll have an initiative that we've just launched. By next summer, we will have projects that will be able to connect the arts with other non-art sectors, because it's still the same message. The arts are everywhere, they infuse our lives. Let's make sure there's an initiative where other people, even outside the arts, are saying, we can't do without the arts. So in an arts initiative, creativity connects. But travel is a big deal, and I know all of the chairmen have traveled. Jane Alexander, every time I go somewhere, they say, Jane Alexander was here too. So I'm really following in your footsteps. But traveling, because we have a very robust network from service organizations, great state arts agencies, regional arts organizations, and many more, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of arts organizations out there that have been sparked by NEA grants. So I've been to 100 in the last year. I've been to 107 communities in 30 states already. And to see the arts thriving is part of the activity that we're doing, is to simply send out the message. The arts are thriving, and we've seen firsthand what it can do. So let's strengthen that whole network.
Well, let's pick up on that, and let's talk about where the NEA goes from here. This is an agency that's doing so many things that it wasn't doing back in the very beginning. What more should it be doing? I mean, Jane Alexander, you began to touch on this. You talked about the internet, how much more is out there that hasn't even begun to be explored. What do you see as the future of the NEA?
Well, I think it's in a wonderful direction, and I just want to send out a shout out to all my colleagues here for everything that each one of you contributed, which I think is amazing. And we do build off of each other. Yeah. There was elimination of individual fellowships with the exception of literature during my administration. I would like to see those come back.
Totally.
One of the reasons is it is the role of government also to recognize that many artists work individually. They are not necessarily aligned with an organization. They would like to be perhaps, but they're not. So I think that this is really, really important. And then I would also like to see something like what Mexico has, which is a national treasures, awards men and women who are aged artists who have reached a certain amount of fame, and then have the government award them.
Like the Jazz Masters.
Like the Jazz Masters. A monetary prize, though, and Mexico's very, very generous with its artists and really supports them for the rest of their lives. Ultimately, that would be a beautiful thing to do, because it's one thing to be given the honor of the National Medal of the Arts. It's another to be given $250,000. So those are the kinds of things that I would like to see. I think it's on great track, especially with Bill and Rocco and Jane here and Frank some years ago, but going into communities. I really, really think you guys have set that up beautifully, and it's reaching everywhere, and the internet will only make it more so.
Pick up on that. Rocco, Frank, I want all of you to be part of this conversation. Rocco?
Well, I think there are a couple of specific fixes that could be made, some things that could be done to make the agency operate better and more efficiently. This is a little less visionary. One is that the NEA has this odd system where 40% of the money is re-granted to the, as Jane referred to them, the great state arts agencies, which is, the NEH doesn't have that, I don't believe. It's particular to the NEA, and it came out of the troubles, the controversies. It's an odd system. It's peculiar. It's a little bit like delivering lettuce by rabbit. It's just a weird system the way that's done. It's unnecessary and inefficient. The other thing is the NEA councils. I think the president should appoint a council at the beginning of the term that serves as the council for that chairman's tenure. What happened to me, and I think happens from time to time, is you inherit a council appointed by another president, which immediately politicizes the whole process. The council I inherited was generally very good and very dedicated, but there was a significant minority of them that politicized the process, politicized the approval of the grants, and created a lot of stress and tension that didn't need to be there. That's an easy fix. The council members should serve terms concurrent with the chairman, I think.
Frank?
I agree with both of Rocco's observations, and the council is a very odd animal. No matter how it's structured, it's an odd animal, because the grants are really made by the chairman. And sometimes the council thinks it's a board of trustees when it's really not, but that's a separate conversation. But I do think, when the agency came into being, it was a kind of high point for national respect for the fine arts. This is back in the time when you could get a painter or a musician on the cover of Time magazine and so on. And the Kennedy administration was by far the most fine arts-oriented administration before or since in the history of the U.S. And the endowment was launched out of that almost at the time that American vernacular culture exploded. When August Heckscher gave his report to President Kennedy, which outlined what the NEA would look like, that was the same week that Bob Dylan released his first album. And within a few years, you had Rolling Stone magazine, you had Pauline Cahill, and you had this explosion of the vernacular. And I think the agency, as it moves forward, needs to continue to find ways to connect with that part of American culture that was not as apparent in the mid-'60s and is very, very much there now. So I think that is a real opportunity. And on a practical level, I think the NEA is in good shape. I will say that it can be almost like a miniature environmental protection agency, in the sense that the EPA provides a hub for an area of citizen interest that didn't exist a half-century ago. And now it's one of the biggest things in government. And that notion of being a hub, a policy hub around which the arguments and the conversations can happen, I think is a very, very important role, particularly since the budget, we hope it will grow, but it's never going to get gigantic. But that function, and that, to me, from a practical level, means should fight to keep the face-to-face meetings going. Panels are critical. That's where the agency creates a sense of community and collegiality. And just say quickly, if I hadn't met Ellen Lovell, who was the head of a state arts agency, when she was serving on the folk arts panel of the NEA, I would never have been chairman, because she ended up through a circuitous or wandering path in the White House, and she was the person who advocated for me internally. And that relationship was forged in a panel meeting at the NEA. So I think that's the way the NEA can continue to play that role, which is not one that has a big dollar price on it, but it's very important.
Frank Hutzel, what about that?
Well, I agree with everything that has been said, but then I would also raise two issues that haven't been dealt with by really anybody, and they may be beyond what the NEA can do. One is the enormously long period of copyright that has been brought over from Europe, which really gets in the way of new creativity. It's all about Mickey Mouse, which makes lots of money, and I'm not against that. But it's an issue that I've been on the Hill, and it's dominated by the large corporate interests, and I would like to see the NEA develop some conversations about that. And the second is that, and this gets to something that Bob Lynch has been involved with, is to increase, particularly at the local level, by lots of jawboning, if you will, the community conversations about why the arts are important in different parts of the country and in different places. And I think it could do more in that area as well.
I want to add one quick
Yeah.
thing. I think there is an issue in which the endowment can play a major role, and is playing some role now, but it's a big international issue, which is the impact of natural disaster and warfare on living culture and on cultural assets. And I think it's an important issue, in part because it affects the lives of millions and millions of people around the world, but also it's an issue that brings many kinds of parties together. This is where you can have your meeting with the Department of Defense and you can have, you know, all these characters in a room at the same time about something, and that's, I think, a very
And you
important.
see that with some of the art that's grown out of things like whether it's the Haiti earthquake or even in this country, Katrina, and in terms of warfare, I know we at the NewsHour have done, we've looked at artists in conflict zones, whether it's a lot of it in the Middle East, but other places as well. Jane Chu, talk about what we've been hearing, and then I want to push all of you really even farther into the future as we wrap it up in a few minutes.
Yes, and to build on the role that the arts can play, certainly in the times of disaster, and what Jane Alexander started with a charrette, a simple charrette in Oklahoma after their bombing disaster. We have to celebrate that one of the greatest things that the arts can do is also honor process, and the process is just as important actually as the end result. So the quality of bringing people together through that charrette led to a way to have people with the arts express themselves and express their grief when the use of conversational linear words were not enough. But I dream of America getting to the point where, when I think about our Native American friends and a number of the tribes who do not even have the word arts in their vocabulary, not because they don't have the arts, but it's the opposite, to have the arts so infused in their everyday lives and their activities that it's just a given. Nobody ever thought that arts would be separate, that it would be in a corner, that it would be a frill, that some people could participate in the arts and others could not. And so when we get to that point and we're able to say the arts are for everyone, all Americans have the opportunity to be engaged in the arts, it's a role that the National Endowment for the Arts can stimulate and play through all of these ways, and actually we've been able to appreciate very much what the state arts agencies have done because they are out in the field making a real difference, having just come. So you can always appreciate whatever setup you've been given. You can always appreciate that, and they having just come from the field,
20%.
I know that. Having just come from the field, I know that sometimes the nuances are a big deal, and when you've seen one community, you've really only seen one. So we're appreciating the network that we have. But get the arts out there. Have everybody say, we can't do without the arts.
So let's, in the few minutes that we have left, let's push all this forward. I mean, what is your dream for the arts in this country? I mean, we've talked about the agency, and the agency role is at the center of that. But what more do we, do you as an agency, do we as Americans need to be thinking about as we think about the arts?
I would start by saying, because we would get to a point where people just got it and said the arts are playing such a role, not only in appreciation of art itself, but it's in our everyday conversations. Because what we're seeing is those with the creative mindset, and the arts are at the heart of that, have a role to play as a community leader, have a role to play as a leader. So can we have the arts at the center of the community leadership and being called in to say, what do we do next? How do we envision going forward?
How do you, any one of you, Jane, Bill, Rocco?
Well, for the first time, largely as a result of some very dedicated and intensive work by Joan Shigagawa when she was the deputy chair at the NEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis now includes the arts as part of the GDP. That the arts are, there are 5 million arts-related jobs in this country. There's a vast part of the economy that's related to the arts. The federal government now recognizes this as a real part of the economy. And this kind of recognition needs to go all through the government and all through the society, that the arts are an integral part of who we are as a country, part of our economy, part of our culture, an essential part of our nature, of our nation. And I think that is starting to happen more and more, and I think that momentum, I hope, is going to continue.
Go ahead, Bill.
I know probably 3 of you have read my 2 books, but I will say, I'll build on something that Jane mentioned, which is the impact of technology. I'm convinced that the U.S. is at a real turning point culturally, and that's something of a crisis point. Unlike the Industrial Revolution of 100+ years ago, we're not looking at the social effects of technology in a comprehensive way. We're piecemealing it. We're being eaten alive by it in a way. And there is a huge need to figure out what our world and how our lives will be organized in what may well be a post-consumerist society in which work is no longer the great source of meaning, in which people no longer give up family to go off to the office, in which we don't have the money or the job satisfaction to make that the primary arena of meaning and personal achievement. And so we need to look at culture in a fresh way, because that's really where we can talk about creative practice, access to cultural heritage, things that provide real meaning in life, connection with community, connection with the past, and personal satisfaction of accomplishment that are no longer going to be there coming at us from these other realms. And so it's partly to push back against the corrosive impact of screens everywhere. And it's partly to say, how do we organize? How do we have a life that is purposeful, that is meaningful? And that means for the endowment, one, has to lead. And then second, it has to broaden the conversation. You know, there's always been that tension. Are we about the fine arts, or are we about American culture in a more general way? And the agency has kind of lurched in different directions around that and has never quite figured out how it wants to define its boundaries. If it's going to lead the way it should and can, I think it's going to have the broadest possible boundaries. Yep.
In other words, both.
Both.
And more. All right, just as we wrap up, I want each of you to say, I mean, if you were here talking to all 320 million Americans, a large number of whom still probably don't get or don't think about in a regular way the role of arts in our lives, what should they be thinking about today? Jane, I'm going to start with you and go.
Well, I really want to thank Bill for bringing up the problem of technology right now, which is the alienation. And we have lost the families singing around the piano. They're watching a reality show on television that may or may not have music, but has a lot of other gymnastics and stuff like that. You know, and selfies do not qualify as art in my book, although they're probably going to be an NEA show soon, helping a community with their selfies in a gallery. Anyway, but Bill, I have read Bill's book, and it's wonderful. The latest one I really liked a lot, and it is about alienation, and the arts can rescue, really bring us back to a kind of healing, a participatory community in which we care for each other through creativity, and that will happen with more arts education in the schools. We must never give up that fight for arts education in the schools. And I do feel that this is a totally legitimate conference that you could have at the NEA, the arts and technology and the alienation in society.
Okay. Frank?
Well, I agree 100% with what Jane said, but the arts and technology is even broader than that. It's not just a question of what people are doing by themselves, but the fact of the matter is that we're going in more and more in 20-second sound bites. This is a problem for commercial publishing. It's a problem for films. It's a problem for even drama and in the theater and so on and so forth. And there needs to be a national conversation about how one encourages the more in-depth sort of involvement in the arts that goes beyond the, if you will, the 20-second soundbite, which is a problem. I don't know how one does that with the younger generation, because the younger generation has pretty well taken on, I can look at my iPhone or whatever and move on to the next thing. But some of the most profound aspects of the arts take a little longer than that. And how can we make that a part of our lives as well?
Bill, and then Rocco and Jane.
It's a surprisingly hard question. I think if I were to be speaking to people out 300 million people about the why, I think I would have to say a few sentences about the agency as it exists, and maybe inevitably go to the agency as I would like it to be, which is that this is the agency that invests a small portion of your tax dollars to ensure that the environment in which you learn about the great achievements of the past, that environment is there and open to you. And it's also the agency that ensures that the tools that it takes for you to feel that you have a personal creative voice, that those tools are available to you, are accessible to you. And I think those two things together constitute maybe both something of a reality, but also a little bit of a vision for what the NEA could be, if it is that kind of hub around which a conversation can happen.
Rocco.
I agree with that. One thing I think that we're just in the incipient stage of it. It's always been around, and I think it's starting to gather a little more momentum, but I think it's an important future opportunity, which is the role of arts education in education reform generally. It's a big subject. It's one where the NEA can't fund in any meaningful way, but can really, I think, use its platform. We commissioned a study by a UCLA professor who did deep dives into all kinds of longitudinal data, the census and labor department and so forth. And there's a lot of evidence that education that includes the arts create vastly superior outcomes for students, staying in school, going to college, higher earning jobs, et cetera. I think that this is almost a magic bullet that if it's framed right and presented right, the NEA can be a powerful advocate for arts in education reform generally, and I think that's a subject that's right there for us to start with.
Very quick, very quick.
Add to that, 'cause the arts education was a huge part of what I did. And we ended up starting with Bill Bennett at the Department of Education and then Riley under the Clinton administration, coming out with national standards on the arts. They were adopted by all 50 states. And yet today, the latest information I have is precious few of the schools are using the standards or are really doing anything in arts education other than what they did before. And so the bottom line to me on education, we're talking about 16,000 school districts. And I think that had I to live this over, having hierarchical pieces of paper from the U.S. Department of Education, from all the state state school officers and the like, doesn't really get you from here to there. You got to convince schools, maybe set up model schools. So something for you, Jane Chu, as you do education, you might think about how you can. And you may be doing it, I don't know, how you can expand the interaction and create model school districts like the A+ schools in the Carolinas and so on, which are a good example, and they are, and have that actually happen, because having the pieces of paper with all the seals and stamps and governor's signatures doesn't get you from here to there.
So, Chairman Chu, you get the last word, and I think I just heard about 25 things that need to be on your list of top priorities.
Start making my list. I'd love to cobble together everything that you've said, and we are thinking in terms of something that you'd referred to, Bill, and that is, are we able to create an infrastructure or some kind of a climate that sparks creativity in so many different ways? Arts education is absolutely critical. When I went to Compton, California, I saw a turnaround school where they had arts in arts lessons, but they also had for 3rd and 4th graders an arts curriculum that hooked to science and math. And the teacher said, I hooked these kids, and this is a neighborhood school that has very few opportunities. Low-income households and very few opportunities. So hooked this arts curriculum to science and math classes, and the standardized test scores in science and math skyrocketed. Regrettably, the science teacher tried pulling the arts curriculum out for one other lesson, and the standardized test scores went down. These are anecdotes, but there is a relationship when you start looking at the research. We've seen what the arts can do even for other aspects of our lives. So let's create an environment that stimulates arts education and make sure that we start as early as possible in the pipeline. We've increased our grants up to from the former 25,000 to up to 150,000 now, renewable, because we've got to stimulate the whole school districts that bring in community arts organizations that are really doing great work out there, and let's have the whole system rise in terms of that ability to start that pipeline. In addition to that, though, arts connected to other aspects, we really need to send out the message and have everybody understand in so many different ways that the arts are really at the center core, that they add a dimension to our lives that cannot be just something else by itself. So the arts infuse our lives. Anything we can do to connect them and appreciate that creativity, we're going to do.
Thank you. Let's thank everyone on this panel. Chairman Chu, Jane Alexander, Bill Ivey, Rocco Landesman, and Frank Hotzel. Thank you all.